Good evening, everyone. This is the policy subcommittee of the school committee, and this meeting is being recorded. We have a fairly lengthy agenda for today with a lot of different items to discuss. We might as well begin. So very quickly, have other subcommittee members had an opportunity to review the minutes from November 9th? All right, would someone like to move them? All right, thank you, Andy. Is there a second to moving them? Thank you, Jennifer. Your vote, Jennifer?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. Okay, next on our agenda is a discussion of the Heath School name and possible school name change process. And for that discussion, we are joined by Dr. Sevelius, the principal at the Heath School. Go ahead, Dr. Sevelius.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here tonight. I'm not quite sure what to do, so I'll just kind of talk a wee bit. I sent a letter this morning to the Heath community. Just in the start of my letter, I actually say with this letter, we invite you into a conversation about identity and recognition, the history of slavery in our community, and deepening our commitment to school safety and complex change. And I think that was a true invitation. Doing, it's very public, a matter of public record at this point that the Heath School has connections to the Heath family, which has connections to slavery here in Brookline. And while I've known this for just a wee bit of time and learning more and more every day, I was finding it less and less comfortable to kind of sit with that information or talk piecemeal with some people here and there about what it means or what should we do about it. And so it's just becoming more and more uncomfortable. And in my letter I sent to the Heath School families and the community today, I also wrote that knowing our beloved school is named for a family that enslaved other humans has made it increasingly difficult to promote our vision for inclusion and equity. And so at this point, that's kind of where it is. A reckoning, informational, invitational, and I look for partners, thought partners, certainly committee members, if that's the direction we're moving into next, opportunities to have complex conversations like this Tuesday night. Tomorrow night is our PTO meeting, and I certainly look forward to hearing from people there and in more formal settings. But at this point, that's kind of where it is right now. So I'm not sure what else I can say or you can help me, how you can help me, how I can help you.
I'm just curious if there are some students who have come forward, certain Heath School families who have been expressing some degree of urgency around this.
No, not students. I know some outside community members, people who've actually been doing some of the research around the Heath School family or the Heath family and the connections to Heath School and the community. Other people who have been who were involved in the renaming process with the Florida Ruffin Ridley School. So again, there's just a lot of chatter around it, but no actualization. I do know that once we activate with students and inform them, and they start to hear about this and hopefully have conversations this very night with their families after their families have read this letter today, that I am positive that we will have a robust cohort of kids across the grade levels who are really interested in being a participant in this work. I know that our teachers, based on work that we've done internally as a staff in November, are very interested in participating in this conversation. And so I think there will be a lot of excitement and momentum. Again, at this point, no process has started. I think also, I've spoken also with the members of my school site council, so they're well aware of kind of this, conundrum and conversation around complex change. I think what's exciting is that many times what happens is that people go immediately to solution. Oh, I've got a great name what about this idea for a name, or how about this as a solution? And that's not really what's, I think, is happening right now. I think really, again, right now, it's just setting the stage so that we can engage in complex conversations as a community, in committees, and then as with our students, teachers and students alike. And so that's what the next stage of the planning is in my mind.
Okay. Now, as school committee members may recall, we did go through this process quite recently when the then Edward Devotion School had a placeholder name of the Coolidge Corner School for 2 years, and then was formally changed to the Florida Ruffin Ridley School, its current name. And part of that process involved a lot of public input from students, from alumni, from parents, from interested stakeholders. There were a lot of public meetings that took place, a lot of town halls around it. Town meeting got involved because as a technicality, the school committee does not actually control the names of schools. We do have control over the names of spaces within schools, but ultimately there would need to be a warrant article presented to town meeting. There's also a naming committee for the town that gets involved in that process. And there's a school committee member who is a member of that committee. I believe that member is still me for maybe another year, but that somewhat rotates from time to time.
Yeah.
Now, there had been a lot of people who felt that the process around the devotion name change was perhaps a bit too protracted. It lasted a long time, and it did utilize a lot of staff resources because our interim superintendent at the time was attending a lot of those meetings, which took him away from other important work for the district. So I do think we would probably want to go in a different direction this time, still have a very public process, of course, but be more efficient about it, perhaps. Do other subcommittee members have some thoughts? Andy?
Just a question, does it have to be that we separate the decision to get rid of the old name from the decision of which new name to choose, or can it be that it sort of happens in one blow?
I think it could probably happen in one fell swoop. So the last time it was a two-part process where school committee did come up with sort of the placeholder name that did not go through town meeting. But then for the actual renaming that went through town meeting and the naming committee. So yes, I do think that would be procedurally possible, but I'll confirm that.
That would speed things up.
Yes. Valerie?
You're a town meeting member, David. What's the general time frame for warrant articles to be submitted for the spring town meeting?
So usually warrant articles are due approximately 3 months before the date of town meeting. It only takes 10 signatures for a warrant article to be formally presented before town meeting. And then the petitioners of that warrant article speak on behalf of their article to various boards. So we would have the petitioner for this warrant article speak to school committee, speak to the advisory committee, to the select board, and then each board would make recommendations about whether to endorse the warrant article or not. Now, when we were renaming the devotion school, school committee was a co-petitioner on that warrant article. I then presented it before town meeting. The naming committee also convened, had some public meetings. They ultimately voted on Florida Ruffin Ridley as well. But it was at times a spirited debate, and people get very passionate about names.
If I can jump in, I again, I'm not looking for, I felt a couple of things. Is the timing right on this? And David, you kind of alluded to that. Is there an urgency? What's the urgency around this? And there's no, there's no fire, right? So to speak. Like I said in the letter I sent out today, it's just becoming increasingly uncomfortable to do the work that we find valuable and meaningful and sets a vision for kind of the next generation of learning and the current students in our building. And so for me, that does feel like a fire. Is this the right time? I have no earthly idea. We have a lot going on. Oops, sorry, that's my wife calling. We have a lot of things going on right now. We're working on really big bucket things in the district. We are all hyper-focused on a few really important things, but is there ever a right time to make big changes? I don't think so. I just think the time is kind of always right, and we can make space for all the things. I hear it's already also moving towards a name change, and I want to recognize that that is most likely the destination we will get to, but I really want to make sure that we're able to have a grieving process and a reckoning process that allows us to get there together. Or for us to understand why we've gotten there together. And so for me, that feels really important too. And if we do get to a point where we have a new school name, I want people to, you know, and I think this is everybody's intent. We all want to get there together. So at least we understand how we got there, not just that suddenly we're there. And so I do consider that kind of I call that like a grieving process, and then a re-reckoning or a reckoning and a peacemaking process. And so those are the things I'm really thinking about while I'm creating these opportunities, or we'll start to create more and more opportunities. Again, it was at 9 a.m. this morning when people in my community got this letter. And so right now we're still in the very early stages of this conversation called the what's happening stage of the work. And so I want to get to other places really quickly and clearly with folks as well. But I also want to not have a protracted process where we're just exhausted by the end and we're left feeling more empty than full. So
I appreciate that. And it is important to make it an educational experience so the community understands why there might be a name change and why it would be uncomfortable for students to be entering a building that at least indirectly was named after a slave owning family. My understanding about the history of it, because we did have an ad hoc committee on school names, and there was research done into all of the names of our school buildings. And the Heath School was named after Heath Street, where it originally was located, but Heath Street was named after the Heath family. So it's only one step removed from being named after a family that included slave owners.
Right. Yeah, so it's complicated. And so how do we make this accessible and valuable for as many people as possible?
And I do think we'll probably be receiving a lot of public input shortly, because you just said that the letter went out this morning. I know that on Facebook, there's already a bit of a discussion about this, just based on seeing this as an agenda item for this evening's meeting.
That's right. So yeah.
Any other thoughts from committee members, or I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. I was going to say I've gotten just a few emails today, and I think that, you know, for the most part, very engaging and eager to get started. The families that I have heard from or spoken to in person. So.
Okay. Any other thoughts from subcommittee members or from you, Superintendent Guillory?
No, thank you, Dr. Asa, for bringing this forward. As we talked about, this is sort of the early stages, but again, one that we need to address and have conversation about at this point. So thank you, and to the Heath community for your willingness to engage in this dialogue and process.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you. So I guess that'll conclude this agenda item for now, but we'll definitely be in touch about next steps.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. All right, so next up on our agenda is a discussion of the change of title from to Brookline High School Head of School. In a lot of our documents, it's still, that position is still referred to as Headmaster, which obviously has very disturbing connotations. Now, informally, we've already moved toward head of school designation, but there is great interest in actually formalizing that change. And there are a couple of ways we could go about that. So we could entertain a motion today that we would like to recommend to the full committee that we officially change the title to head of school. The second part of that process, though, would be to ensure that we actually change the language in our policies. Headmaster is mentioned in a lot of our different policies. So a couple ways we could go about that is through this motion I'm referring to right now. There could be a general commitment to change the name and then go policy to policy and actually change, substitute each instance where the name comes up. Now, in some of those policies, we might want to make additional changes beyond a name change because the policy might have something substantive that we're interested in working on. And so rather than addressing each policy multiple times, if there's a policy that we were going to work on regardless, we might consider making it a two-step process for that reason. But I'm open to your thoughts about how you think would be the best way to proceed.
Can I just
Go ahead.
ask a clarifying question? And Andy, how is this referred to in the contract? Can you remind me?
I think it may not be consistent at the moment.
Okay.
Dr. Guillory?
So thank you. So Val, I think to your question, I think in some places it's still referred to, at least in the CBAs that I've seen, as headmaster in places, and in other places it uses the nebulous principal. And so some districts, quite a number of districts are using for the high school, at least for the high school level building leader and associate or assistant head of or assistant, use the term head of school, a head of schools, and assistant or associate head of schools as such. But I think also, David, what I've also discovered is looking back at an older section. I think the last time maybe the cabinet was updated was back in '84. So there may be some other titles that we also need to just formally bring current as well, I think, to Andy's point as well. Also, so we started with this particular one, but I think there are others right now within the cabinet that, at least in policy, refer to the old titles, which are different from the current titles that we're actually using. So there will be, I think, a need to bring a broader scope of those positions forward as well.
Okay. Jennifer?
It's just a question, actually. Does somebody have the background on why we use headmaster or head of schools instead of principal at the high school? I just don't know the history of it or why we create a different title for that position.
I can certainly get some more on it. I think just in I happen to be, I think, in the Boston public school system at the time when they were switching from headmaster to head of school, for at least for the secondary schools, whereas at the elementary or the middle schools, they use the term principal. I think it's just a holdover from the older nomenclature that used to be used here. So it was my first being up from Texas and New York. It was my first time hearing the term head of school and headmaster in referencing high school principals. And so I think it's just a holdover type of title, but one that you tend to see especially at your large high schools. And it's not consistent across the state, but it's either principal or either head of school for those that have used that title before. Some of the language and some of the policies used to also, so similarly to headmaster, that was also a term that we'll see in some of our policies that are also referred to as housemaster, which I think, again, for the connotation that David referred to. So the idea was to move away from that language to head of school as such, but we can get some more background information on that specific title.
Jennifer, are you partially asking that question to see if maybe we should be changing the name to principal rather than head of school?
Well, that was sort of my reason, is like, if we're moving away from that language, do we move to a more uniform language? Although, like, it is a pretty large school. And so that's why I was just I was trying to understand also the district's perspective on where we would like to see this language land. And do we differentiate the high school from our other K-8 schools with a different title? It's really a question. I understand moving away from headmaster. I'm all for that, but how, like, are we moving to head of school? Are we going to principal or something different? I don't know. Maybe I'm just trying to see what the value is, or understand other people's perspective on the value of head of schools versus principal.
My recommendation to you all will be to move to head of school. And I can certainly provide some background context for that at a future meeting.
Any thoughts from other subcommittee members? All right, seeing none, I would like to do subcommittee members feel ready to move at minimum a recommendation to the full school committee to remove the name Headmaster from our policy handbook. All right, thank you, Jennifer. Valerie, I'll go with you as the second. All right, just go ahead and vote on that. Jennifer?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Andy?
Abstain because I had a question that I didn't get a
Okay,
chance to ask.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Why don't you ask your question?
Well, the motion is to remove head of school from all occurrences in the policy manual. But
No, remove Headmaster.
sorry, so to remove Headmaster. So what replaces it since we're not making a substitution right away?
It sounded like some members would like further discussion on whether it should be principal or head of school. We do have the recommendation from Dr. Guillory about head of school. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Mine was really a question. I was just seeking to understand greater, where we wanted to go. I think I'm okay with head of school. I can't, unless somebody present, I wasn't opposing, I was literally asking. So I'm fine with that. If we want to go ahead and amend your motion or whatever the language is to replace headmaster with head of schools, I'm all for getting headmaster. And if we have the house master, I'd like to get that language out of there too. I don't know. But at a minimum, I'm fine with moving from headmaster to head of schools. I mean, that seems reasonable to me. And if that's the district's recommendation, I'm happy to support that.
Okay, is there a second to the amendment?
Yeah, I'll second the amendment.
All right. Well, I guess we have to finish the first vote since we're midway through. So Andy, you abstained on the first motion? Okay, and Valerie?
We're on the first motion with unamended, right?
Right.
So then I abstain from that.
All right, and I'll abstain as well. Okay, so now on the amended version.
Wait a minute, I'm stuck.
So we
with
left
the
Jennifer
vote.
high. We left Jennifer high and dry here.
Can we just
Right.
withdraw the motion or something?
Okay, I'll withdraw the motion. There we
Can
go.
we do that? Don't leave me hanging like that, or I'm gonna have to abstain. I don't know. I don't want to be alone. No.
Okay, motion is withdrawn. I
Okay.
just thought we couldn't necessarily abandon one mid-vote, but withdrawing the motion works. All right, so now on the amended version.
Now
Jennifer.
it's just, no, it's not amended anymore. It's the motion because the other motion was withdrawn.
All right, so
Sorry.
now you have a motion to make a commitment toward changing any reference to headmaster or housemaster to head of school.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second
Okay.
that.
Okay.
All right, Jennifer, your vote.
Yes.
Andy,
Yes.
Valerie,
Yes.
and I also vote yes. All right. Next on our agenda is discussion of the draft restraint policy, which you should all have a copy of. And this does look significantly different from our current one. I modeled it after the policy in Cambridge, the policy in Wellesley, the MASC stock policy from 2015. I also looked at some pending federal legislation called Keeping All Our Students Safe. I have received some early feedback from Casey, and I look forward to hearing your input. So what are your thoughts?
Could we first hear from Casey, or is that incorporated?
That has not yet been incorporated. I received her remarks this morning. There were not many, maybe 3 or 4 edits, but nothing major. But I'm going to look through what she sent me.
David, has this draft been made available to the public yet? And if so, have you received any feedback?
It has, yes. It was publicly posted with this meeting, and also I have received some feedback. from members of CPAC and from other stakeholders. And some of their remarks have been incorporated. So one change that Casey recommended, for instance, was to be consistent about superintendent or designee, wherever the superintendent's being asked to perform a task. Also, there was a suggestion about being less stringent on the number of hours for training. Andy?
So I guess when reading through section F, which is the very long section that has a lot of procedure in it, it read to me like something, it was at a level of detail and specificity that makes it seem like something that should be part of sort of the superintendent's procedures rather than necessarily written into the policy in a way that requires a school committee vote to modify it. It's a very general sense I had about that entire section, except possibly for the reporting requirements, which do seem like they ought to be in the main policy rather than separated out as procedure. So I don't know, Linus probably has a more informed view on what should be policy and what should be procedure here.
I can get back to my screen. I was reading again. So no, I think, so what I was really interested in doing at this point, I think tonight is hearing sort of the collective or the thoughts from the committee. I want to definitely do a deeper dive with it as well, based on some of the conversations we hear tonight, but I agree with you also there, Andy. I think that there's those types of things that shouldn't be at the policy level. The policies should sort of be the overarching or the higher level pieces, and then how we instituted our implementation should be more at the district level parts there.
So, David, I maybe missed it, but I didn't see a prohibition on a prone restraint. I saw about breathing, difficulty breathing, but I didn't actually see a prohibition on.
I think it's farther down. Sorry, I'm interrupting.
No,
I
if you
just
know where
saw
it
that.
is.
Let me see, yeah. It is,
So it's on the third page, second paragraph.
yeah, there you go.
The use of prone restraint is expressly prohibited.
Okay, got it. It's in the definition section. I just didn't see it in a,
Do you think we need to move it?
well, I just didn't see it mentioned in anywhere else. It's defined, but I didn't see it actually mentioned in a paragraph.
Well, it's also under letter C. So other limitations on use of restraint. It says the following practices are expressly
There
prohibited.
it is. Yeah, subsection 3. I see it. Thank you.
And I think, Val, you're also pointing out that prone restraints were also prohibited, I think, in Mass General Law as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's just ensuring that those pieces are connected there as well.
So meaning having a specific citation to the Mass General Laws where there's a mention of its prohibition.
I think we should we should make that connection. So again, I think, so I know that there was a possibility of a vote, but I would recommend that we not vote tonight, that we just go through this process of getting some feedback, kick it over to the senior team for us to also gather some additional input as well. And then we bring it back to you as a revised draft.
Okay. But in terms of citations, would you like to see more statutory citations?
I think My thoughts are the big one is definitely the prone, and then also being consistent with the minimum aspect being what are the annual training requirements, and I think we need to exceed those minimum requirements as such. And I wouldn't necessarily go overboard with listing a bunch of citations, but given that this is also parallel to the one from the school committees group, I think it should have some of those in the background in terms of its preparation.
Right. If you look at the Cambridge, Wellesley, and MASC policies, they basically follow this exact same structure. Some of the main changes I put in, I did considerably expand reporting requirements from what some of those other policies had, and I altered the language in some other places. But in terms of structure, other towns are following this basic model here. Jennifer?
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the section on definitions. I think that's very helpful for family members and community members to especially if they're not familiar with that language. And the inclusion of the differentiation of timeout and exclusionary timeout and timeout in the classroom, I think is important to keep in.
Any other thoughts from Andy?
I thought that for clarity, it would be possible to condense sections D and E maybe into one section because they're whole sentences, I think, that duplicate each other in those sections. D is, what's the heading of D? D is proper administration of physical restraint, and E is safety requirements. It seemed to me that those two could be collapsed.
Okay. All right, now we do have some members from the public who might be interested in offering.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one more comment, which I think is a best practice, and so maybe it doesn't go in the policy, but I would like to raise it as a best practice, which is that there be a timeliness in switching out of staff on restraints, so that it isn't the same staff member or two staff members who are doing a restraint for an extended period of time. I think that it's a matter of good policy and also better for both student and staff involved.
All right. If
And
any
we
members,
can think about whether that is policy or whether that is in something that comes from the administration.
okay. Is there a certain section where you think that should go in?
I think I was thinking about the timeliness of a restraint being concluded as soon as is practicable and everybody's safety is secured, that essentially just adding a line that if it extends beyond X number of minutes, that the staff members change out.
All right. Any other thoughts from subcommittee members before we go to the public? Andy?
Just a background question about our definition of seclusion. I think in our in our existing policy, seclusion means that you're physically prevented from leaving, and our new definition also includes that you reasonably believe that you'll be prevented from leaving. I don't necessarily object to that definition, but I'm wondering, like, where did the change come from? Is that something that's now standard?
This was the definition that was appearing in other towns' policies.
I believe that's now the DESI definition.
It is or is not?
I think it is in
Okay.
barring seclusion.
Okay, great. That's what I needed to know. Thanks.
All right, so if members of the public would like to offer input, please raise your virtual hand. All right, Robin, could you allow Connie Claus to speak?
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Hi, thank you, David. So my name is Connie Claus and I'm the co-chair of the Brookline CPAC. I will definitely defer to Dr. Guillory and Casey on this and wait for the revisions that they recommend. I just wanted to give the committee a compliment that Faith Dantowitz and I attended a roundtable discussion hosted by the Federation of Children for Special Needs last week about the use of restraint, seclusion, and timeout in schools. And this policy is very much in keeping with all of the recommendations that we were hearing from them and that are being recommended statewide. And just to build public awareness, this is a topic that's being discussed throughout the state. It's not just Brookline. And this is I think as we're emerging from the pandemic and we're starting to see the amount of stress and trauma that our kids are experiencing as they're returning to schools and trying to get back into the normalcy of their life. It's really created a great opportunity for us to evaluate best practices, and that's kind of being done across the board. So I just wanted to say thank you for the revisions to the policy and to continue to have these conversations and not be shy about discussing what we really need to do for the best interests of our kids. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Would any other members of the public like to speak on this subject? All right, seeing none. Any other thoughts for today on the restraint policy? So I do agree with Dr. Guillory that the next step that would make the most sense is to have staff look over this with greater detail and make a round of edits. And then when we come back for our January meeting, we may be in a better position to make a recommendation to the full committee. I do think this is a good start and that it was important for us to have something in front of us that we could try to digest and be able to discuss in a more informed manner. All right, so next up on our agenda is a discussion of the draft pesticides policy. This was also publicly posted, and all of you should have received copies of it. This policy was modeled after the pesticide policy for the Iowa City School District. There are actually a lot of states that have school policies on the use of pesticides. Massachusetts, however, is a state that doesn't have much in the way of that quite yet, although our neighbors in Connecticut and New York have done a lot of work in this area, as we heard at a previous meeting when we had State Representative Vitolo explaining to us what's taking place at the state level. As a school committee, we already voted to endorse state legislation that would look to ban the use of pesticides on school grounds, except in emergency type situations. The policy that's before you for your consideration today essentially tries to significantly reduce the amount of pesticide use, or really only use it when we absolutely have to. I did have some discussion with Erin Galentine, who is the Commissioner of Public Works, to gain a better understanding of our current practices in this area. She wrote to me an email, which I'll read to you. Hi, David, thank you for reaching out. The Parks and Open Space Division utilized an integrated pest management approach townwide. Pesticides and herbicides are not used unless absolutely necessary. We do not use either in regular maintenance of school grounds. The one exception where a pesticide product may be used is in response to calls for removal of hornet wasp hives on school grounds, a big concern due to allergies. We are tough, but removing live and active hives is prickly. I hope that this is helpful, Aaron. So any initial thoughts on the pesticide draft policy? Jennifer?
And it looks okay. Has Erin had a chance to review it? They do a lot of our maintenance, right? And then we were gonna maybe check in with Matt Gillis and see if there would be, what the impacts of this would be for the district. So I just don't know if we have any of that feedback, or is it all go through the town, like DPW?
The vast majority of it goes through DPW. Now, where the schools will come into play is for an indoor application, which would almost never happen. Maybe if there was a major infestation of some kind of vermin, then perhaps it would be applied. But for the most part, it's DPW. I have spoken with Matt Gillis about this. He mentioned that pesticide use is at a minimum. I wasn't able to get a lot of specifics from him. I did talk to Helen as chair of capital about the pesticide policy. She seemed fine with it. And I do see that we have Mr. Clint Richmond, chair of the Green Caucus, who would like to speak. Robin, if you could give him speaking privileges.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clint Richmond, who was the member of the public who had proposed that we adopt or support the state law, and I am very thankful and grateful to this subcommittee and the full school committee for supporting that bill and taking the next step to adopt a policy that's more in line with the language and goals of the proposed bill. I guess I'm still a little concerned about the actual text in terms of how it aligns, and I realized that I had not seen the policy beforehand. And those watching from home, you have to go to the school committee site, not the town calendar, I think, to get those handouts. So I'm actually looking for them myself now. But the language of the bill, I guess I would ask how does the proposed policy differ from the actual language of the bill, which requires only organic pesticides? There is still an emergency section in the state law, which is, let me see, section H. So there's already exemptions for emergency situations. So I don't think you need to be any more, I mean, I guess you could sort of adopt that language, but you could, I think, just use the language that's in the proposed bill that the school committee has already voted to endorse, I guess is what I'm saying. So I guess that's a question for you, Mr. Chair.
I think the one practical problem that we might have is we don't control, as a school district, at least not directly, the use of pesticides on our grounds. We would certainly have influence, I hope, but this is something that the DPW is doing. So I think that, at least at the moment, the most we could do is state our commitment to avoiding pesticides unless absolutely necessary in an emergency situation. I do think that this policy promotes that concept, but it does not outright require the use of organic products. The DPW seem to indicate that they are using environmentally friendly products for treating our school grounds. I take them at their word on that. But that is one practical difficulty that we have, and that we're not the ones who actually administer the pesticides or the alternatives.
Well, I guess I would question that, or, I think I share your concern that it's hard to monitor this, and integrated pest management is a very elastic term, and everyone claims to follow it. It doesn't prohibit pesticides. It just is you're going to use them in a minimal way, but it's not specified. There's the IPM plan that each school is supposed to file. There's also in the state statute, I believe it's section I, no, I'm not seeing it, but every school and daycare for that matter needs to have keep a history of all pesticides that have been applied on site for going back 5 years. I've never requested that, although now I'm tempted to. So there are special rules for schools, even if it's DPW who's maintaining the grounds. And I would really say that at least for the grounds that the school owns, maybe as opposed to those that are shared, that you do have, perhaps greater control, and you could start with those and say for those where it's owned that by the school that you want this policy followed. In a way, you're sort of delegating your responsibility to DPW, which is certainly your right and makes, probably sense. It makes sense, operationally, financially, et cetera, not to have duplicative staff. But I think we need to recognize that the health and safety of our children is paramount, and that this could be followed everywhere. But obviously for grounds that you don't own, perhaps, I don't know. I mean, that's sort of a gray area, maybe a town council type thing, but I'd like to see, greater cooperation between the school committee and parks on this issue, because all of our parks are used, or at least for those parks that are heavily used by children or have play areas, that they should be following similar rules, I would think. But at least in the case of schools, and this is going to come up in the next discussion, when parents send their children to school, they don't really have any control over exposure. But if they don't want to go to a town park and they have a suspicion that maybe pesticides are being applied there, they can say, well, I'm not going to go to that park. But they don't have that choice with schools. So, thank you.
Okay. So the current, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, go ahead. I'll wait till after you're done.
All right, I was just going to say that the current draft policy only states 3 instances where pesticides may be used. 1, students or employees are experiencing significant discomfort or unsafe conditions, and the use of toxic pesticides is essential to mitigation. 2, damage is occurring to a tree, shrub, plant, grounds, or facilities, and cultural and biological methods have been used unsuccessfully or to a great degree of certainty would likely be unsuccessful if deployed. 3, population dynamics of pests indicate that significant increases in pest problems are inevitable, and only toxic pesticide use presents as a viable option to decrease the pest population. All right, go ahead, Jennifer.
Now, I guess now I'm thinking about what you just said. So I guess I'm wondering, Clint, were you expecting or hoping that this would specify no use of pesticides or only organic pesticides? Or I'm just looking to sort of clarify. I mean, I would love to be able to put in organic, like limited or organic pesticides or herbicides. But is that what I'm just trying to understand how far apart we are from where we could be.
I guess, yes, to follow the language of the bill that we've just supported and, sort of get up maybe on a glide path here to compliance with this. I don't know what schedule we might set, and maybe that was something to be worked out, by staff in consultation with DPW. But the bill H 926 limits all. This is only outdoor use. It doesn't say anything about indoor use. Section 6G is only organic pesticides. So that's things like clove oil and chrysanthemum extract, and that sort of thing would be used to control pests, whether they're and I think there it's really more health threats, because I guess I'm getting out of my depth there. I don't know what organic herbicides they might need to use, but I believe all the pesticides would have to be organic, and there are organic herbicides as well as pesticides, which you might think of for insects or possibly rodents or that sort of thing. But as I said, there's this section in the state law that has an exception for public health, where similar to what the chair has proposed here for when all other methods have been determined not to work and so forth. But I think we might want to hew closer to the state law, since that's sort of governing anyway in terms of the exceptions. But in terms of the outdoor use, I would propose organic only.
Go ahead, Valerie, and then I'll go back to you, Jennifer.
I just want to make sure that we get something on the books for Brookline because to my knowledge, that bill hasn't had a hearing yet. And by the time the legislature comes back, there'll be less than 6 months of session for them to move that bill, and it may not move this session. So in the interim, we have no such protection here in Brookline. So my statement is just that I would like us to have something in the interim because it could move quickly or it could be a long road at the State House.
Jennifer?
Speaking of rodents and pests, did Erin have any feedback on what the town's plan and therefore, and maybe what the school's plan is for the increased rat population that currently is blossoming? Has there been any information on that?
No, I have requested it. Hopefully we'll get an update on that by the time we next meet.
So you have been getting some feedback, some inquiries about this.
I am as well, yes. That's definitely a concern.
And so I'm just wondering how that plan sort of integrates with this pesticide policy. I don't know what an organic green alternative to get it to, like the increasing rat population. I don't know how we balance those.
All right, any other thoughts from committee members or anyone else?
So are we voting or tabling, or what are we doing with this one?
I'm open to hearing what others think. So we could table it and review another draft next month that perhaps more closely mirrors the proposed state legislation. But to Valerie's point, we don't know that the state legislation will actually pass. And even if it does pass, it could take a very different form. When I've had discussions with staff around having a policy on pesticide use, there was reluctance to name any particular products that we would prohibit for a couple of reasons, not necessarily because there's a desire to use it, but over time, technology evolves. There are lots of changes that occur to the way pest management is treated and how it operates. And sometimes we don't want to be in a position where we have to be revisiting our policies every few years because there's a technological change. So sometimes being a little more general can actually be advantageous for that reason. If you get too narrow and specific, and then the situation changes and we have to go back to revisit our policy, that might not be as practical. So that's one concern I have. But I do respect Mr. Richmond's point about if we're comfortable endorsing the state legislation, then we might as well match as closely to it as we can. So my personal recommendation would be that we come back with an updated draft next month that hopefully will have some more detailed updates from staff, because this policy does not, at least very clearly, cover what would happen indoors. We don't have answers to those questions yet. And this would seem like a good place to incorporate some of those issues that we've been hearing about by email and with calls from concerned stakeholders. So even for that reason alone, I think it would make sense to hold off until the January meeting so we could have a chance to gather that information and include that in this policy. Jennifer?
I'd also like some more information. I mean, I'd like to see if we can move closer to, an outdoor organic green space policy. But I also want to hear more information from DPW about what's happening, because a lot of our outdoor space is in conjunction with the town. Do you think there's any chance that we could have Erin Galentine come to our meeting and talk with us and have a conversation about it? Or do you think that's going to be very challenging? Just time-wise, I don't know.
I think we could hopefully get her to come on. I know that she's participated in subcommittee meetings before. She does presentations on parks, on school playground maintenance, usually once a year. So hopefully she would come to be able to speak to some of these issues. It would also be helpful to have Matt Gillis come on and talk about what we do inside the school buildings and have some of those details. Even though this is an imperfect draft, of course, I wanted us to have something in writing that we could review, because in past meetings, sometimes we just talk about issues in the abstract with nothing that we're really looking at to comment on, and that can make it more difficult. But policy drafts, of course, evolve. That's true at every level of government, on up through federal, where you have a first draft and then you gather more information and then you listen to input and make revisions accordingly. And I think that's what we're going to be doing here. I was a bit surprised in my research of other school districts to find that Massachusetts districts don't seem to really address pesticide use, at least in a standalone policy. I was also surprised that even in Connecticut and New York, which did pass state legislation essentially banning pesticide use except for emergency situations, that even those school districts did not really have any explicit prohibitions to the degree that the proposal in Massachusetts is seeking. The closest I could find was the language that we have in front of us, which is coming out of Iowa. Go ahead, Jennifer.
So first, I want to say thank you for creating something for us to respond to, because that's incredibly helpful. I do think it makes our conversations more productive. So I thank you so much for taking the time and doing that. I think it would be great if we could come back in January and have some of these folks who can give us some more of like what this looks like on the ground, so that we can see how much movement we could make. I agree. I think to Val's point, we want to have a policy on the books so that we can move towards this, especially minimizing usage. It would just be helpful for me to know, like, how close can we get to, I would like us to be as green as possible. That's my thoughts. But at the same time, I want us to also have something in there that allows us to respond if what we're doing isn't working. And if we have an infestation or we have urgent needs that we need to take care of, because that's going to be in the best interest of kids, their health and safety as well. So it would be really helpful to have a little bit more information for me.
All right. Any other comments?
I'll just say, just in terms of structure of this policy, I think just the framing, the manner in which it's laid out, the broad goals, the expectations, I think, this is, and it's digestible, meaning that everyone can read it, have access to it as such. So I just want to say I can appreciate the framing of it as in terms of how you've worked to establish this as a policy. I think it's a nice model as we continue to engage in reviewing and revising and adding others.
All right. Any other thoughts? All right, seeing none, we can move on to our next agenda item, which is an introductory discussion on potential policy for school ground surfaces. And I know that this is also an issue of great importance to Mr. Richmond. So why don't you go ahead and introduce it for us?
Hi, I didn't know if I needed to be, I was muted myself, sorry. No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased that the school committee is prepared to take up this issue, which, as we know, has been very controversial throughout town. But it's been unfortunate that each project has been operating on kind of a case-by-case basis, and that we don't have a policy, and that the issue of artificial turf intersect with both with several different goals and objectives. One of which is environmental, in terms of preservation of green space, and I mean green space with plants on it, not just open space. Health concerns, and I know that the Advisory Council on Public Health is going to be taking up this topic as well. There's new information coming out all the time. These are very complex products with not a great deal of disclosure, with a lot of money behind them. So it's been a difficult conversation, I think, for the public to deal with the providers of this. It is a technology, The new emerging information has really been around PFAS, which is a class of synthetic chemicals that are persistent and generally have higher levels of toxicity than just traditional materials like plastics. But there are fluorinated plastics, which it's my understanding that every field that's been tested has these fluorinated polymers in them. And that was something that wasn't even known when we did the review at Cypress Field. So, as well as the pressure for athletic fields. But, from an environmental standpoint, we already know that the Brookline Green Space Alliance wants to preserve, space with grass or plants, which I think is being reduced, for example, at Driscoll, and was reduced at the Ridley School by the installation of artificial turf. We heard from the Solid Waste Advisory Committee that they're concerned about generating 50 tons per acre of waste every 10 or 12 years when these fields outlive their useful life. We've talked about environmentally preferable purchasing and how we can utilize that to inform our decision making, so that we're not just saying, "Hey, this is a field. We need people need to play on it." That we need to consider these broader environmental impacts. So we had an initial hearing about this in the Driscoll project, and the actual installation of the Driscoll field is sometime off. So I think it's useful to have this more robust discussion, to hear from more stakeholders, and that we develop a policy so that we don't have to keep addressing this on a project by project basis with other schools, in particular the Pierce School, which I've not been following, even though that's my original home school for our children. So I guess is that enough of a summary for you, Mr. Chair?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Valerie, would you like to maybe comment on the process with Driscoll into selecting artificial turf?
So I came onto that project pretty recently, but we had Erin Galantine at our last meeting, who went through the public meetings that were held on the decision to proceed with turf and the type of turf that's being used at Driscoll, which is fairly similar to what's being used at Ridley. And there were several parents who attended that meeting to once again speak to their support for turf, having had experience with the Driscoll field being essentially unusable for the vast majority of the year. So the project currently is still on target to use turf, barring us making a broader change in policy or in law before that.
Now, how do subcommittee members feel about pursuing a policy on how we make decisions around the type of surface we're going to use on school grounds? Do members think that we should have a certain process that's codified, a series of questions that we ask ourselves before making that determination? Should it continue to be a project by project decision? I personally feel that we would benefit from at least having certain questions that get asked and gathering certain information and being consistent about it and methodical. Not just in terms of having public meetings, which of course would always take place, but also just making sure that whatever the project may be, that we are reviewing the same variables and the same metrics, so that there's at least consistency in approach. All right, seems like Jennifer likes that. Andy, Valerie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I like what you just said. For me, I think that's about as far as I'd want to go on the policy level. When I just think about the complexity of the Pierce site that we're trying to design for right now, like it would be difficult to be constrained by a policy that actually dictated what we were to do, but a policy that spells out the important things that we need to look at, I think would be helpful.
So yes, in principle, I guess my only question for everyone is whether it's better to work on a town-wide policy that impacts playgrounds and things similarly, or whether we just want to focus on schools and leave the town side without collaboration on that.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I think that speaks to the larger issue, which is even with the prior, if my memory serves me well, and David, perhaps you can help. When the high school, when Cypress Field came up, there was wide opposition at town meeting to it. In combination with the fact that we don't manage a number of the playgrounds that we utilize, they're town parks. It really does limit the scope of how much land space we're actually able to impact at the school level versus the town level. I just don't know how that work would be approached. I don't know where, like how that work gets done, because we clearly don't have the authority to tell other town departments what we want them to do, even on shared sites. So I don't know what that work looks like, but I do think it speaks to the larger issue of what direction does the town want to go in? As the town is paying for both the town and the school, sites. So what is it that we want to do? And I don't know. What are the trade-offs that people view with turf versus with grass, and the long-term impacts and public health and global warming? And there's a lot there, and there's people who feel very strongly. So I don't know. I don't know how we can, I don't think it's enough to just focus on the school side, but I'm not really sure how much we can influence what's happening, on the town side, just as a committee.
All right, any other thoughts? Go ahead, Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to reiterate the point that I made in the previous discussion about pesticides, that for parents who want to protect their children from toxic exposure, and we know that children are more susceptible to toxic exposure because they're still developing biologically, that I think the expectation that many parents would like to have is that I can send my children to school and know that they hopefully won't be exposed to any toxics at all, whether it's pesticides or PFAS on turf. But they don't have a chance to opt out. So, they can't say to their children, well, my child can't play on a turf playground. And that, because otherwise that might mean there's really not an area for them to run around in. And that I feel that the schools have sort of been unfairly burdened with a high level of usage that is not school related. And by this, I mean athletic programs. And that's one of the reasons for the terrible conditions that are sometimes observed at our school playgrounds. So I do think that there's an appropriate role for the school committee to assert that we want to provide access to nature. We need to provide access to a safe environment, and not have to suffer from this other usage that even Park and Rec study says all our fields are used too much, and there just seems to be increasing demand. Our population is still growing, so sports is very popular. So I do think that the school committee should take a policy with respect to playgrounds, and acting kind of in loco parentis here to say we're going to protect you from toxic exposure to the extent we can. And it's not enough to say, well, there's a trade-off here, and that it's okay to expose children to toxic sometimes, but not other times. And what's the equity between the schools? We preserved it at the high school, but now we're saying, well, no, we're not going to keep doing that. We're at Driscoll or Pierce, we're going to still entertain the idea of artificial turf. So I urge you to at least make a policy statement that says, maybe no more turf. And I also would, warn everyone that if that doesn't happen, I think there's going to be further action at town meeting, so that, there are people who feel very strongly about this issue, on the pro, natural grass side. So it's not going to be laid to rest, I don't think, without a policy. And I think, people are going to propose that the select board also might develop such a policy, so that we're not going to have any new fields that are artificial turf, because there have been complaints about them, even at Driscoll, and I've been there myself. It's very, very hot surface. It's unpleasant to play on, and there can be, contamination of the surface. It just doesn't even happen with grass. So I think it's an unfortunate development. It's a fairly recent development in history. It wasn't true when I went to school. So I just urge us to hold on to our principles and reduce toxic exposure. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other comments from, go ahead, Jennifer?
No, I'm just, I'm not sure what our next steps are, but I don't know what that policy would look like. If we were to make one. David, you always sort of craft the first level for us. But I am concerned about toxic exposure, long-term exposure, soil contamination and pollution, as well as what's happening to our students. And that's got to be our priority and our goal. I don't know. So I don't know what that policy would look like, but I would be supportive of not using turf and using natural materials in general. Whatever we need to do to make that happen. That's where I'm at.
All right, Valerie?
So I agree with Jennifer, but I guess to Clint's point, there aren't that many spaces that we actually control. And so town meeting may, quite frankly, be the most appropriate place for this to be addressed. So, so Clint, that was actually, music to my ears. If we're looking to sort of address it on a town level, that there may be an actual townwide vote on it, I think is probably going to be the most comprehensive way to address the issues that have been raised.
I think part of the problem with an outright prohibition is the proponents of synthetic turf say that the science is not super clear as to how the toxicity levels can affect students. And so they would argue that there really isn't a significant health risk, that it's more theoretical. They would also argue that sometimes synthetic turf might be better for athletes in particular. So those points are argued to some degree. So I think it would be important that we also be presented with the medical literature on this subject. I personally support natural grass for a variety, even if it's a theoretical risk. I think that what's most important is protecting the health of our students. But I also want to be respectful of those who have other perspectives and who might feel that the medical literature states otherwise. So hopefully that information could be provided to us before we moved in the direction of an outright prohibition. And then also to the point about whether this is better done at the town level, I think we could do it at both levels because we don't have direct control over what the town's going to do. It does seem that town meeting is moving in the direction of natural grass. We saw that in the context of the high school. And we are certainly free to have our own policy. We do control a majority of our playgrounds, but not all of them. Now, I do see there's another member of the public who would like to speak, Ms. Wendy Stahl. Robin, if you could give her speaking privileges.
Hi, yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that Clint is not the only concerned person, and I'm glad to hear that you are all, the members of the committee here tonight, also concerned about natural grass versus synthetic turf. But I do want to add one more voice to the argument that the school can make its own independent policy with respect to this. I think that both having the town-wide and the school policies happening concurrently, whatever they end up being, would be beneficial. The school could end up leading the town on this. I mean, it would be wonderful if the students' priorities were met even quicker than the whole town's. But with your comment about the potential medical benefits of synthetic turf, there's there's plenty of data that can be given your way about the the medical detriments of synthetic turf, certainly. So if you provide the opportunity for documents to be given to you on both sides, I think that we can definitely get this argument settled. Thank you very much.
Any other thoughts? All right, so seeing none, I think that our next step on this is to continue the conversation, gather more information. I would like, if we could, to move in the direction of supporting natural grass. But I do want to give an opportunity to all stakeholders to provide their thoughts, their input, their research materials. And I also respect what Andy said earlier, that sometimes there can be challenges presented by specific sites. So I would think that the way we might structure such a policy, if we move in the direction of supporting natural grass, would be to not make it an absolute, but a preference, just like with our pesticides draft, where we're trying to minimize pesticide use, but if there are circumstances where pesticides need to be used, we can still use them. Might be a similar way to craft a policy for surfaces on school grounds. Any other thoughts? All right, seeing none, we can move on to new business. Thank you very much, Mr. Richmond and Ms. Stahl, for joining us. Is there any new business? Okay, I have a couple of items. So one of them, listening sessions. Now, I don't know if this would be something we would want a policy on, but we have been inconsistent institutionally in terms of how we conduct listening sessions with educators and other stakeholders. So I'm wondering whether subcommittee members think that this is an area where we would benefit from having a policy. Andy?
I think maybe it belongs more among the school committee norms, especially if we're putting together a set of communications norms.
Okay. We do have a communications policy, so that might also be a place that could fall into. All right, any other thoughts on listening sessions? Okay, and then the other item I wanted to raise under new business, it's been brought to my attention that there are some students, I believe in 4th grade, but also in other grade levels, who would like to be learning more about civics, even from a local government perspective. And apparently there has been some work in that direction with individual teachers, but not at a district-wide level. I personally believe that we would benefit tremendously from teaching our students about how government operates at all levels, including local, and actually especially local, because we've seen that when students become very engaged, particularly around climate actions in the context where it most comes up, that they can benefit very, very directly. It was really our students who pushed for composting at our schools, and they got it done. And I think that if we teach our students about how local government operates, we will see more activism and involvement on their part. And it's going to inspire them to participate in the democratic process for their whole lives, if they can start right now. So I do think that whether as a subcommittee or if it's something for central office to think about, how we can engage in more outreach with our students around local government. Jennifer?
Are you thinking of a policy around this, or just how we as a committee can do more outreach? Or are you thinking about this as a curriculum issue? I'm just trying to clarify.
I'm open
Yes,
all
I
three.
agree.
So
Civics, good, yes. You're thinking all three?
just meaning it could fall into either of the three. I don't think it has to be all three. I'm bringing it up now because maybe it's something that we address with a policy, but it could be something that's addressed through curriculum. It could be something that's just addressed internally as a committee, could fall under communications. I'm not sure exactly where it would fall, but I do think it's something that ought to be addressed.
I personally would like to hear from Leslie and the social studies curriculum coordinators to see if there's room. There are tons of requirements, and I want to make sure that we're not putting something on them that at a grade level that doesn't necessarily work, or in a way that doesn't necessarily work. I completely on board with civics and engagement and local government, just figuring out the best way to do it. I think
I personally
it
don't
behooves
necessarily.
us to speak with them. Yeah.
I personally don't necessarily think it would have to be a requirement, but it could be even an extracurricular offering or something we make available that students can volunteer to learn about how local government operates, but to at least provide that path in some manner. Jennifer?
So my suggestion was going to be to, that I would be happy as chair of curriculum to talk with Dr. Leslie Ryan Miller and, just talk with her and see if she can get us some more information from the social studies curriculum coordinator about where the benchmarks are, where the state standards are, and where they fall sort of in a vertical alignment with the grade levels, and see where it falls within our curriculum right now and what's happening. It may be that some of those curriculum pieces happen at a different, not necessarily in fourth grade, but another time, which doesn't mean that there can't be pieces of it in there. I like your idea of like an after school sort of offering. When we do things like model UN and things like that are, obviously not local government. I don't know what the potential of that is, unless you were suggesting school committee offers such an event themselves. But if it's all right, I think before I would suggest moving to a policy, I would suggest a conversation at curriculum. And I actually have something in mind that this would fit really well with some potential upcoming agenda items at future meetings. So if that would please the chair, I'd be happy to come back to policy in December with an update on that.
All right, I'd appreciate that.
I do think that's great, Jennifer. And I'm intrigued too by the after school piece, and each school does their after school programming differently. The K-8s, and just thinking through that it could be an offer, right? Like, I mean, one of my sons is doing Scratch programming in January. I mean, you can sort of do, anything after school in terms of subject matter. And I think this would be a great offering that lots of our young people might like to engage in outside of curriculum or in addition to, depending upon how it lines up.
Yeah, I know that civics it's definitely in the social studies standards. I just don't have it at my fingertips to share where that falls, but I know we can get that. I love, like even David, like the idea of a forum. We've done stuff before, like, I don't know, pre-COVID, where you utilize the space at the library and invite folks to come, and like we could invite students and committee members could, talk about, or it's select board members, different members of different, it would be an interesting thing for not only I think students, but families, because I think that there is some level of like, just folks don't really know how the local government works. How do you get things, if you want to see change in your community here in Brookline, what does that look like? How do you do that? How do you advocate for the things that you're passionate about? I don't know. It's a really interesting idea, David. I like that idea. So I don't know what that form would look like. I don't know what after school programs could handle as far as like the capacity to do that kind of work. But from our perspective, like I'm happy to give up a night and, talk with kids about how to get involved and how to make things happen, especially with our students. We've seen so much activism from our students. It's a cool idea. I love it.
Yeah,
Right,
I love it too, David. Thank you for bringing it up.
I'm glad. And I like this forum idea as well. And because I think the interest is there, it's not as known. Like you said, a lot of people don't know about how local government works. It only takes 10 signatures to get a measure voted on at town meeting. And town meeting is always very welcoming whenever we have students who come on and speak, whenever we have students authoring resolutions or warrant articles. It does happen, not a lot, maybe 1 or 2 per session. But I think it would be a good way to energize our students and see how their involvement in the democratic process can directly lead to changes.
We could have them run a mini town meeting and actually have to gather signatures and write the warrants.
What's the status of the, we passed a warrant article to allow 16-year-olds to vote in town elections, right? Is that stuck at the state level right now?
It is, that's still at the state level.
All right.
All right, so anything else under new business? Okay, well then that concludes our meeting for this evening. Thank you, everyone. Bye.